Gyurcsany. Can you tell me the history of Hungary?
Célom az, hogy jó legyek, a társam oldalán. Most sok a harc, a küzdelem, de győzelem vár rám. Motiválsz, ez meg kell csinálni, így győzünk a legfényig. Motiváld, az de igaz barát, a győzelem vár rám.
13 billion years ago, Hungary did not exist. Instead, Hungary, just like everything else in the universe, was just a bunch of gas and particles floating around in endless space. But that's boring. So, quick fast forward to 10 million years ago, and Hungary was underwater, inhabited by a variety of majestic sea creatures, such as prehistoric sharks, whales, dolphins, and the largest fish to ever exist, the megalodon, widely considered the country's golden age. However, the sea slowly dried up and eventually became flat, boring land, which then 850,000 years later, odd bipedal creatures known as humans thought of as the perfect place to come and bang rocks against one another and make pots to store those rocks in, also considered the golden age of Hungarian music. This golden age was interrupted with the arrival of the Scythian Chuds that invaded in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, who were then followed by the Celtic tribes in the 4th century BC, and in the east the Dacian Chuds. Despite their best efforts to hold and claim the beautiful and majestic lands of Pannonia for themselves, all of the ancient Chuds failed at achieving this task, as the Giga Chad Romans came in and civilized the local population and integrated them into their glorious empire. As Rome expanded more into the east, they conquered the lands of today's Hungary up to the Danube River, making it into 2 new provinces, and then later on pushing further east into what is today Romania and its province of Transylvania, where they beat up the ever-loving Christ out of the Dacians that made their leader, Decebal, kill himself out of frustration. In their conquests, they also settled the newly conquered regions with their own people. However, if there's anything ancient Hungary has to teach us about this time is that too didn't last, as for some reason everyone wanted this piece of land, and new barbarians started invading and subsequently, at worst, murdering the local population, and at best, making them flee, depopulating the Pannonian plains yet again. This severely weakened the Roman Empire, who already by this point split into 2. But the final nail in the coffin for Western Rome was the arrival of the Huns. Who were the Huns? What did they want? Where did they come from? Did they prefer Ray over Asuka? To this day, we still don't know exactly. But what we do know is that they absolutely caused utter and complete chaos. With their invasion, they settled in the XC basin, and from there on, orchestrated their campaign of terror against Rome, east and west, and even beyond. However, in the mid-5th century, Attila, their dear great leader, died, and the Huns lost their shit and collapsed worse than a 20-year-old communist's ideals after getting a job outside of Starbucks. Following their disintegration, more Germanic Chuds started coming in and settling the territory and fighting each other. Because what else were you to do in the 5th century with this beautiful landscape? In the mid to late 6th century, the Avars arrived to the Carpathian Basin and, like everyone else before them, kicked out and killed the local Chuds, settled their own, and intermingled with the remainders, whilst also bringing in other nomadic groups with them, such as the Slavs, whilst also subsequently launching raids on the Roman Empire. This lasted for around 200 years until the Franks, the Germanic successors to the Western Roman territories, beat them up, causing them to have an autistic meltdown of their own, much like the Huns, and just start burning everything in sight until they exhausted themselves from all the fighting and pillaging, which left them open for a new round of invasion. Deep in the Ural Mountains of Russia, roughly 5,000 years ago prior to this point, a new tribe known as the Magyars emerged. And as today, no one in Russia wants to live beyond this point Neither did they. So they packed their bags and headed westwards, where they over time came under the rule of the Khazars and adopted their way of life. For the next millennia, the Magyar tribe, like the other nomadic people from Asia, continued migrating west into Europe. However, unlike them, who had their eyes set on the lush lands of the Romans, the Magyars were more simple, humble, honest working people, and instead settled for establishing their homeland between the Dnieper and Dniester River in modern-day Ukraine, which they called Etelköz, from where they take up noble, honest work of being mercenaries and fighting in forever wars in Europe, which isn't that much different to the situation in Ukraine today, but I digress. In the 9th century, their primary employers were the Moravians, who intended to conquer large swaths of the Carpathian Basin for themselves. However, in 895, the humble and peaceful Magyar lands of Etelköz came under attack from neighboring tribes and kingdoms. Being under attack from all sides, the Magyars came up with such a brilliant idea that even the greatest scientific and military minds such as Albert Einstein and Arthur McDouglas couldn't even conceive even in a million years. They abandoned their lands and supposedly followed a bird westwards and settled in the Carpathian Basin, completely turning 180 degrees than the Moravians and taking the lands for themselves. In the true spirit of every single Pannonian invaders and would-be settlers, the Magyars too took up the famous hobby of ransacking European kingdoms and principalities, going as far as invading the Iberian and Italian peninsulas so badly that the Western European chuds mistook them as returning Huns, which continued for a good 100 years. Getting fed up with horde antics, the Franks raised an army and confronted the Magyar nuisance in Bavaria, and for the first time absolutely annihilated their asses. According to legend, only 7 Magyar soldiers made their way back home, fundamentally shaking the country, which practically stunned everyone else in Europe, and the Pope proclaimed the Frankish king Otto I the Holy Roman Emperor. On the other hand, the Magyars, deeply shaken by this defeat, retreated back to the basin where they fell into a deep existential crisis and took a long deep look in the mirror and reflected upon their actions. Megvesztünk? Hát, tudom, hogy ez nem az először, de ilyen borzasztóan. Ennyire utálnak? Várj, lehet, hogy mi vagyunk az emberek. Lehet, hogy ez volt az evangélium jelentése?
Mint a leszakított, haldokló virág, mint az 5 millió magyar, akit nem hall a nagy világ.
So, the Magyar tribe leader at the time, Géza, and his son Vojk came up like their ancient ancestors before with yet another brilliant, mind-boggling 10,000 IQ idea. Convert themselves and the tribe to Christianity. And so, by the late 10th century, they invited a bunch of Frankish, now German missionaries into their lands to preach the good message of the Lord to their people. The Pope and Western kingdoms, pleased with the development in their lands, noticed their efforts and recognized them in 1000 AD as the Kingdom of Hungary, and Vojk, after being baptized, adopted the name István and became known as Stephen I of Hungary.
Látjátok feleim szüntükkel, mik vagyunk, és a pur és homó vagyunk.
Now, the transition into God's arms and grace wasn't completely smooth. 3 years before Hungary got recognized as a kingdom, Géza kicked the bucket. This opened up a perfect opportunity for tribal leaders who liked their way of life, looking at thrown animal bones and birds flying in the sky for guidance and faith, to take the throne and put an end to these silly little Western antics and preserve their ancient way of life. És szóla Isten mindezeket az igéket, mondván, ne paráználkodjál. Hát, jó, ne lapj, értelme van. És ne ölj. Tessék, ne ölj. Ez micsoda? Örölt vagy? Ez ellenzik az ősi magyar hagyományokkal. Ez kurva lehetetlen! Yet, with the backing of his people and German reinforcements, István was able to defeat the would-be usurpers and baptize Hungary into a new age. After Hungary joined the Christian world, István spent the remainder of his rule reforming the country to resemble its Western counterparts. Hungary established its own church, and medieval governing institutions such as feudalism slowly started to spread. Although, unlike the West, power in Hungary was much more centralized and essentially resembled an absolutist monarchy. But hey, when some pagan wannabe warlords try and take your god-given throne away, would you trust them with a huge chunk of land? I don't think so. And what do you know? István's distrust ended up being justified, as a couple of years later, his line of succession was yet again disputed. Because, f*** it, it's medieval Europe, baby! István's nephew, being an unrelenting chud stuck in the ways of the past, claimed the throne based on the right of Hungarian pagan beliefs, whatever that meant, which prompted István to do the thing any rational adult would do in his position: blind him and pour molten lead into his ears and banish his sons out of the kingdom. Absolutely genius. After that was done and dealt with, he instead appointed a different nephew to succeed him. But after István also kicked the bucket, this too wasn't seen as sufficient, and Hungary was launched into a period where everyone and their mothers wanted a throne, whilst bringing in armies from the west to contest it. This resulted in the kingdom changing kings over 6 times in 39 years, while everyone was killing each other.
This succession crisis continued for some time, but nevertheless, the kingdom still expanded its institutions and domain, conquering new territories and growing its population by inviting German settlers to come work the lands and defend the borders in Transylvania against would-be nomadic invaders. But hell, nomadic invaders were not discriminated against either. Many Slavs, Pechenegs, and Turkic peoples were also allowed to settle and intermingle with the locals, which culminated the Hungarian kingdom into a goulash of diversity. Very cool, very progressive.
Sokféleség az erőnk. Meg fogod enni a bogorokat, és boldog leszel. Thank you, Medieval Soros. Very cool.
While Hungary was undergoing political and aristocratic squabbles on who should run the country, at the dawn of the 13th century in the far east of Asia, much like the Magyars, a new tribe was emerging as the dominant powerhouse, unifying squabbling tribe leaders under one single banner: the Mongols. Quickly they laid waste to the ancient civilization of China, and just as quickly they turned their sights west onto Central Asia, where tribe after tribe fell under their feet, further pushing into the outlying kingdoms and principalities of the Kievan Rus, who they too swiftly laid to ashes and filled the waters of the Dnieper River with their blood. By the early mid-1300s, the king of Hungary at the time, Béla IV, sent out a group of monks into the ancient Hungarian motherland of Etelköz, on the rumor that still some Hungarian-speaking people remained there in an effort to convert them to the true faith and bring them to his realm to resettle. To the monks' surprise, the rumors were correct, and a long-lost tribe of Hungarians remained. However, the monks also heard terrifying news that in the east, a new nomadic horde was slaughtering hundreds of thousands. Quickly they made haste back to Hungary to inform Béla, who was overjoyed at the news. He then yet again sent the monks back to Etelköz to guide the long-lost Hungarians back to Hungary. However, the second time they arrived, they could no longer locate them. The only thing they could find was barren fields and death as far as the eye could see. None of them survived the Mongol attack.
After that, Hungary received yet another large wave of migration of nomadic peoples into its realm from people fleeing the cruelty of the Mongols. Alarmed by the news of slaughter coming from the east of the continent, Béla quickly recruited the fleeing refugees into his army in preparation for the Mongols' arrival. In preparation for the upcoming assault, he also ordered the building of stone fortifications all throughout Hungary. But not soon after, the Mongol horde followed, sending an emissary demanding Hungary subdue itself under the Great Khan. But as you can imagine, Béla's mom didn't raise no and he told them to shove their offer up where the sun doesn't shine. Paraphrasing, of course. The Khanate, unimpressed, soon after launched an invasion of the Hungarian and Polish kingdom, sending 2 great armies to execute the task. The Northern Army quickly penetrated Poland and quickly laid waste to every single major city in sight. Not long after, rapidly making it to Krakow, the Polish medieval capital. The Poles tried to fight back, calling up a great coalition consisting of mercenaries and knights from all across Europe. From the Teutonic Knights to the French Knights Templar, thousands of elite knights rushed to Central Europe under the leadership of the Silesian prince Henrik II. But despite their best efforts, they were no match for the Mongols, who slaughtered the European defenders and paraded Henrik's head on a pike across Polish lands. Poland was helpless to stop their advancement and quickly succumbed to Mongol hoofs. And as Poland fell, the Mongols turned south to Hungary. News quickly spread across the Hungarian realm, and fear struck deep into the Hungarian army, with thousands throwing away their weapons and fleeing as far as they could get away from the scourge. The Mongols poured in from the north and east of the country, ravaging the lands of Hungary, murdering every living soul in sight, whilst the Hungarian army was powerless to even put a dent into their advancement. The great stone fortifications built by Béla were no better than mere pebbles in the fight against the Mongol army. In less than a year, over 50% of Hungary's population laid on the ground, decaying, their corpses slowly being devoured by maggots. For they were dust, and to dust they returned. What's even more gruesome is that 80% of Hungary's peasantry was slain by the Mongol blades, with King Béla barely escaping with his head on his shoulders and riding westwards to save his dear life. It seemed that there was no salvation for Hungary, and the lands and its people were destined to become nothing more but a chapter in history books of long extinct peoples, much like the thousands that came before them. But in 1242, a year just after the Mongols invaded Hungary, they unexpectedly just stopped and retreated back across the Carpathians. Their great Khan had died, and all generals received immediate orders to fall back to the capital far east in the depths of Asia for the election of a new ruler. As they galloped across the Carpathians, Béla returned, but instead of seeing a familiar sight of busy built-up medieval towns protected by great and quaint farming villages he had grown to know and love over the years, he saw a kingdom in complete and utter ruin. But this was not the end, far from it. Vowing to never again let his land go through such a tragedy again, Béla immediately upon his return got busy. He invited even more immigrants from across Europe to settle his lands, and started erecting great fortresses and walls all throughout his country to protect his cities if the Mongols ever dared come back again. Despite Béla's best efforts to rebuild the country from ashes, he ultimately, like any pathetic mortal, eventually died, which yet again opened the portal to a succession crisis in the country. Because, of course, in a land that had almost 50% of its people killed and lands pillaged, the most important thing is who is gonna sit on its throne. Luckily for the Hungarians, a French noble, Charles I Robert from the House of Anjou, somehow made it to the throne, and despite being French, he actually made an effort to improve the country. Under Charles, Hungary established deeper ties with Poland and Bohemia at his castle in Visegrad, which broadened their political and economic cooperation. His successor continued this trend of strengthening Hungary by conquering local territories, getting briefly into a personal union with Poland, and even invading and taking control of southern Italy. Because why not? This development continued well into the beginning of the 15th century, when the king made a fatal mistake and died without a male heir, which yet again plunged the country into civil war, losing much of the territories and political influence it had gained previously. But again, luckily for them, another capable foreigner, this time from, you won't believe this, Luxembourg, took the throne. Zsigmond. Under Zsigmond, the situation was yet again stabilized, and he would go on to become the Holy Roman Emperor and even a king of a couple of other countries as well as Bohemia. This gave him an unimaginable ego boost that he decided to launch a crusade alongside the French against the Turks and help Byzantium climb out of the well of shit it found itself in at the time. He managed to sum up an army of 100,000 men and march them straight to Bulgaria, defeating opposing Turks along the way, but ultimately succumbed to a completely unaccountable weapon: walls. In all his time of preparation, neither he nor the French thought of actually bringing siege weapons. So the army just arrived to Nicopolis and surrounded the city hoping to starve out the defenders,
But yet again, they were outwitted, as the Turks, in preparation, stockpiled food, making their strategy of just sitting outside until the city starves obsolete. How could have anybody even seen that coming? In the end, the Turks brought reinforcements and made them fuck back off where they came from, destroying the crusade and humiliating Zsigmond.
At the same time, while Hungary was playing the Central European Game of Thrones, in the realm of the Byzantines, some chuds known as the Ottomans were exploiting Balkan pettiness and consolidating more and more power until they conquered and took control of almost the entirety of the Balkans and the Anatolian Peninsula. And as human greed is as indefinite as the universe, the Ottomans then set their sights onto the Kingdom of Hungary and beyond. After Zsigmond died with an undefeated pullout game, Hungary, again, was left without a ruler. But thankfully, instead of throwing a Game of Thrones bitch fit, the country was kind enough to accept the Polish king Władysław Jagiełło,
to whom they also did a favor and renamed him colloquially to Ulászló, as to make his name actually pronounceable. Ulászló, having big shoes to fill and an ego to boost, decided to authenticate his masculinity like his predecessor and again launch a crusade against the Turks, despite the majority of his advisors, generals, and rulers in the region advising him to wait.
He did the exact opposite and invaded. The Ottomans responded accordingly and defeated the Crusaders again, this time in Varna, and cut off his head. Yet, despite at first glance thinking nothing good came out from this, you'd be deathly mistaken. Throughout Zsigmond and Ulászló's rule, a brave nobleman going by the name of János Hunyadi was able to climb the ranks. As over the years, Hungary and the Ottomans fought numerous battles, Hunyadi became a respected general who was able to lead his men to victory in numerous clashes against the Turks. His military achievements grant him the title of Voivode of Transylvania, as well as the White Knight of Transylvania, and most humbly of all, Defender of Christendom. Although the king died in Battle of Varna, Hunyadi was able to salvage a great portion of his men and retreat. Upon his return, he was made regent of Hungary and the fate of his country was put into his hands. Under his rule, Hungary was able to fend off the Ottomans decisively and effectively. Yet his magnum opus was none other than the Battle of Belgrade in 1456, where outnumbered, Hunyadi raised the country's defenses and annihilated a massive Turkish invasion, because of which the Ottomans didn't dare to invade Hungary again for the next 70 years. And in his honor to celebrate, the Pope ordered church bells across Christendom to ring daily at noon on Sunday, which, fun fact, is still done to this very day across Europe. Unfortunately, the same year, the military genius Hunyadi died, and despite everyone and their mothers in Hungary thinking that the country was about to have another autistic meltdown over who will rule over them, which it kind of did. Ultimately, Hunyadi's second son, Matthias, became elected as king in 1458 with less bloodshed than what was expected. Under him, Hungary would achieve their golden age, the first time since Pannonia was inhabited by fish. Immediately after coming to the throne, Matthias was able to subdue the aristocracy, defeat the Turks on several occasions, and put a stop to banditry in the north of the country. Quickly, he became extremely popular among his subjects, especially as he was known as the king who rode alongside his men into battle and slept beside them in camp. Besides great military strifes of conquering Silesia, Eastern Austria, Vienna, Bohemia, and founding the Black Army, an elite mercenary fighting force only responded to the king, Matthias also became greatly renowned for his contribution to arts, culture, and science.
I fucking love science. I fucking love Charles Darwin.
Under his rule, the Renaissance was introduced into Hungary, and enormous amounts of money went into the development of artistry, architecture, artisanship, and innovation within the country. So much so that some at the time even called Hungary a second Italy. Matthias also ordered the creation of the Corbin Library, where over 2,500 manuscripts found home that delved into subjects from history, philosophy, all the way to science, politics, and everything and anything in between. The regular folk were also not forgotten by the great king. Matthias ordered the construction of numerous new churches, schools, and roads, and unlike any ruler before him, he was known to disguise himself regularly to walk among his peasantry and hear from them firsthand what could need improvement in their communities and to find out if any injustice had been done to them by the local administration. All of this granted him the title of King of the People and Renaissance King. But as every League of Legends win streak ends with some retard running it down mid, so did Hungary's golden age. Just before the turn of the 16th century, Matthias croaked, and although he actually slapped some cheeks and had an heir, because both him and his father didn't come from royal families but some backwits from Transylvania, the nobility didn't accept his son as king. Instead, they elected a member from the WWI dynasty, Władysław II. Unlike Matthias before him, Władysław was a weak ruler and got nicknamed as Władysław Dobrze, meaning Władysław okay, as he would just agree with everything the nobility said and proposed. As you can imagine, this led to the Hungarian nobles becoming ever more powerful and influential, and slowly led to the deterioration of the institutions Matthias had built up previously, such as the Black Army. Furthermore, as the nobility grew more powerful, they started to clash with one another in an effort to extend their influence. This severely weakened Hungary politically and economically, and prompted Matthias to spin so hard in his grave that if he was attached to a generator, he would power the entirety of metropolitan Tokyo. The king in the meantime died and was superseded by an Austrian, Lajos II, who too was not any better. The Ottomans, being no chuds, unlike their Hungarian counterparts, saw this and thought of it as the perfect opportunity to strike and get revenge for the decades of humiliation from the hands of the Hunyadis. Quickly, their forces penetrated Hungary and immediately everyone panicked. Lajos called up the Pope and his family in Austria to come up and do something because his military couldn't even pick themselves up from the ground after a heavy night of drinking, let alone pick up a weapon. But considering Martin Luther, not yet king, was public enemy number one in the German world, the Austrians and the papacy couldn't care less. So, snubbed and left to his own vices, Lajos led his own army to Mohács to try and stop the Turks from taking over his country, to which he absolutely, catastrophically failed, and his army essentially marched to their own deaths as they didn't even bring artillery, essentially bringing knives to a gunfight. Miraculously, Lajos wasn't killed in battle and managed to escape. However, he then proceeded to fall off his horse and land in a river while wearing full metal armor and drowned. The Ottomans then proceeded to easily march their way to Buda, the Hungarian capital, and conquer almost the entirety of the country. The south entirely got annexed. Transylvania was released as an independent principality, but in reality became an Ottoman vassal, and the majority of northern Hungary, now Slovakia, got taken over by the Austrians in an effort to salvage something out of the country. After centuries of nation building, developing institutions, and almost a millennia of history, Hungary was wiped off the map. From the middle of the 16th century onwards, Hungary under the Ottomans followed the same fate as other Christians in the empire. The country was divided into smaller vilayets and sanjaks, while Turkish administration as well as government workers were brought in to govern. Alongside that typical jizya tax that was imposed on non-Muslims and the devshirme system, which was a blood tax taking Christian children from their homes and forcibly converting them to Islam and utilizing them in the military, the Hungarian peasantry was also severely taxed, which stunted their economic prospects. The territories of Hungary also became depopulated, as the ex-kingdom now became, more often than not, a battleground between Muslim forces of the east and Christian resistance from the west. As such, the Ottomans brought even more settlers to fill in labor demand. At the same time, the Protestant Reformation was in full swing, and the majority of Western Europe was full on chimping out over the fact that someone dared to question the legitimacy of the guy in the big hat and even bigger staff. Austria in particular, as it was head of the Holy Roman Empire, was going full-on ape mode and cracking down on heretical beliefs. Inside Austrian-controlled Hungary, Catholicism was strictly enforced, while in Transylvania, Lutheranism and other Protestant denominations, such as Calvinism, found home, as the Ottomans couldn't care less about which one of their Christian subjects was right, as in their eyes, they both worshipped a Semite on a stick, and to them, the only true God was present in squiggly lines. As a result, Transylvania became an epicenter of religious and philosophical diversity, which made its development quite more unique compared to the other parts of Hungary. It would also enjoy various levels of autonomy, so much so that it even fought in the 30 Years' War on the Protestant side. But due to losing several wars, the Ottomans would restrict Transylvania's freedom and get a bit more involved with governing. In the late 17th century, the Ottomans redirected their sights onto Austria and organized an offensive campaign against the mega-chinned Habsburgs. With all their might, they surrounded Vienna and laid siege. Overly self-confident and thinking that the Austrians were nothing more than mere chuds, the Turks turned a blind eye to their defenses. This turned out to be their most fatal mistake, as the Poles saw through their cockiness and struck their besieging army when they least expected it, crushing their army and relieving Vienna. The Austrians in retaliation launched a counteroffensive, building up a large coalition of Hungarians, Germans, Spanish, and even French, with whom they'd go on to reconquer the lost territories of Hungary. For the next decade or so, Hungary was taken away from the Ottomans bit by bit. First, the city of Buda, then Mohács and Croatia, and finally Transylvania. As they reconquered long-lost Christian territories, the Austrians would then proceed to expel the Turkish colonists. This and the fact that a great chunk of Hungary turned into a battlefield yet again depopulated the region. As such, more Germans and Southern Slavs fleeing from Ottoman persecution were invited to settle these lands, to work the lands, and join the war effort against the Ottomans. Finally, by the end of the century, all of Hungary was under Habsburg control. Although the Hungarians at first were grateful for being emancipated from Muslim rule, quickly that gratitude turned to detestment. Even though coming under the rule of the Habsburgs was better than having your child brutally torn away from your arms and put into the service of subjugating faraway lands, the steel chins were not without flaws. The Austrians put upon their own laws and enforced their own Wiener Schnitzel eating, sauerkraut juice drinking culture, and whatever the hell it was, the language they spoke. And worst of all, the lands they conquered back from the Ottomans, instead of giving it to the local Hungarian nobility, they assigned to the Germans. This especially was problematic as Hungary's treasured province of Transylvania was put under direct Viennese administration. Quickly, the Hungarians turned from second-class citizens in the Ottoman Empire to second-class citizens in the Austrian one. As such, the Hungarians rose up against them in 1703, but quickly met their demise. But although they had killed the revolutionaries, they hadn't killed the idea of an independent Hungary. The rest of the 18th century was relatively speaking peaceful for the nation. The Austrian overlords mostly left the Hungarian nobility to its own vices and didn't meddle much into their business, for which they would be repaid later on. However, much of the local state autonomy was revoked and much of Greater Hungarian lands came under direct control of Austria. More and more immigrants arrived to settle the depopulated lands, and Hungary's local populace also started to bloom as new advancements in farming revived the nation's agricultural sector. The Hungarian language, previously repressed by the Ottomans, also saw a revival as its spelling started to get standardized and many books were printed in Hungarian. However, in the later days of the century, Austria entered its famous succession crisis, in which the Hungarian nobility supplied the Habsburgs with men and resources. At the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon sodomized the Holy Roman Empire so roughly and thoroughly that it stopped existing. As a result, the Austrian Empire was officially birthed. As you can imagine, this offset the power balance in Europe and the Habsburg realm. The Hungarian economy tanked as the Napoleonic Wars severely strained the nobility and peasantry when it came to agricultural output. Alongside this, a new idea was taking hold throughout Europe: nationalism. It particularly found itself at home in the hearts and minds of Hungarians who yearned to yet again be an independent nation state. In this time period, a couple of decades earlier, the French did what they do best and revolted against their ruling class. This put the fear of Christ into the Habsburgs that their subjects might do the same and practice their chopping skills with their heads. Thus, the Austrian monarchy, who embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment previously, clamped down on it and limited philosophical and scientific discussion, especially in Hungary. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with God's chosen people, the Hungarians. In the spirit of the Hungarian national character, they doubled down and went contrary to the Austrian ideas. The tension between the two parties continued to grow up until 1848, when the local administration in Hungary became ever more radical and proclaimed their desires for secession, and revolution took place. Croatia, who at the time was in a personal union with Hungary, did not side with the Hungarians, as it saw these new political developments as a threat to its own sovereignty and right. As such, they invaded Hungary proper, followed by the Austrians. At the same time, the local minorities within Hungarian lands also became divided on whether or not to support the Hungarian revolutionaries or the Austrian monarchists. The Romanians clearly sided with the Austrians, while the Serbs and Slovaks split into factions supporting either or. The Hungarians were able to repel initial advances by the Austrians and Croats and suppress the rebellion from their minorities. However, after the Austrians called upon the Russians to join them and end the rebellion, they stood no chance and ultimately conceded defeat. 13 Hungarian generals were executed for treason, and the revolution leader Kossuth Lajos fled to the United States. Although Austria came out victorious in this conflict, it wasn't without cost. The state and its economy were severely weakened, and many of the empire's minorities made their plight for rights known. Hell, some, like the Italians, even rebelled and won their independence. As a result, the emperor had no other choice but to try and negotiate with the Hungarians in an effort to stabilize the country. During this time, the Austrian emperor's fiancée, Elizabeth, colloquially known as Sisi, greatly admired the Hungarian nation and its people. Being a woman before her time, she understood that they were God's chosen and favorite people, despite what the Israelis say, and greatly admired their history and culture, so much so that she accomplished the impossible and learned to speak Hungarian fluently, even teaching it to her child. As a result, it is speculated that she influenced the Austrian emperor to the right side of history and made him more sympathetic to the Hungarian plight. Thus, in 1867, her husband, Ferdinand I, agreed to reform the empire and create the dual monarchy. From that point on, Austria was no more, but it became Austria-Hungary, split into two, with two capitals, two parliaments, under one ruler and one policy. The foundation of Austria-Hungary brought in a new era which saw rapid economic improvement and industrialization all throughout the empire. However, it also brought great issues. You see, the Hungarians were no longer seen as second-class citizens, but were promoted as almost equal counterparts to the Austrians, at least in their own realm. As a result, they got too cocky with their role. This overconfidence in their position birthed the infamous program of Magyarization, where Hungary aimed to culturally assimilate its ethnic minorities and limit the use of their language and culture in everyday life, and instead convert them to full-blooded, living, breathing Hungarians. This program brought a lot of scrutiny from Western countries such as the United States and Great Britain, making Hungary's actions a highly controversial topic throughout Europe. As you can imagine, the Serbs, Slovaks, Rusians, and Romanians did not like having to learn duck quacks as a language, and as a consequence, ethnic tensions started to rise.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
Ultimately, tensions blew up in 1914 when a cheeky Bosnian Serb assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Archduke as he was taking a ride through a newly conquered Austrian territory of Bosnia. Was für ein schöner Tag. Die Sonne scheint. Heute kann nichts Schlimmes passieren. Čekaj, bola, nemoj strat. Nema šanse da je to onaj brat. O sunce ti jebem. Ich stimme zu, Liebling. Ich wünschte, dieser Tag würde ewig dauern. In almost immediate retaliation, Austria-Hungary invaded the puny country of Serbia in a way to enact its revenge, humiliate the nation, and install a puppet regime which would broaden their influence. As you already know, things didn't exactly go to plan. You see, at the time, the empire controlled vast diverse lands where neither ethnicity was the clear majority. The Austrians, aka Germans, barely made up 23%, and were the nation's largest ethnic group. The Hungarians were almost 20%, and the rest were a variety of different Slavs, Romanians, and Italians. Because of this, military cohesion was one of Austria-Hungary's greatest struggles. A large chunk of the conscripts didn't even speak a word of German, let alone could take orders from their German commanders. Another issue was that quite a large chunk of the empire's population was made up, as I mentioned before, by Slavs. In the early 20th century, nationalism was one of, if not the most prevalent of ideas in the Slavic-speaking world, who was, more often than not, under the rule of a foreign empire. And many of them were sympathetic with Serbia and weren't that keen on going to slaughter their brotherly people. What made things even more difficult was that in the beginning, much of the Hungarian administration was also against the invasion of the country and propagated for more diplomatic solutions. Thus, for a good year and a half, Serbia was successful in fighting off the numerically superior and better equipped Austro-Hungarian army. The tide only started to turn once Bulgaria and Germany joined the offensive, with whom the Austro-Hungarians were able to annihilate the Serbian resistors and force them to retreat all the way to Greece through the unforgiving Albanian accursed Alps. But even so, things weren't made easy for the empire. In the east, the Russians proved themselves as a force to be reckoned with, and pulverized the empire's forces, even forcing them all the way back to the Carpathians until the Germans, yet again, came to their aid. In the west, the Italians also joined the fight against Austria-Hungary, and helped make a war that was supposed to be quick and easy a living, breathing nightmare. But the troubles also didn't stop there, as the Romanians too had their 2 cents to give and tried to take Transylvania. Although their effort was quite laughable and ultimately ended up with the Austro-Hungarians marching down the streets of Bucharest. All of this spread their forces thin and strained their already weak military cohesion and struggling economy. In the middle of the war in 1916, the emperor died and was replaced with a new pacifist emperor who gradually seeked to somehow put this dreadful conflict to an end. And although the Central Powers were successful in defeating Russia in the east and gaining vast swaths of land, they then had to turn their efforts westward, which over time became a painful war of attrition. This started to put great strains on the Austro-Hungarians and German economies, so much so that in Hungary, a land that came to be known for its unmatched agricultural output, food and other resource shortages started to become a part of daily life. As a result, more and more of the Hungarian working and peasant class started to get radicalized, and new songs of revolution appeared on the horizon. This sent shivers down the aristocracy's spine, and in an attempt to secure their own power and not be overthrown by the peasantry, As the war was coming to an end, they attempted to secede from the empire and turn the country into a democracy whilst addressing the plight of their ethnic minorities. Unfortunately, it was too little too late. The Entente rejected their pleas and made known their plans of seizure of vast Hungarian lands and punitive punishment. This plunged Hungary into a state of utter and complete chaos, from which the Communist Party led by Béla Kun seized power in a communist revolution and almost immediately rejected demands of the Entente and launched a hastily put together invasion of the newly formed Czechoslovakia in an attempt to preserve historical Hungarian lands. Béla, if you couldn't tell already, was retarded, and his decision to go into a new war right after the last one was still devastating the country instantly came to bite him in his ass. The Romanians, then supported by the West, acted in retaliation and came to the defense of Czechoslovakia and invaded Hungary, essentially steamrolling through the country, making it all the way to Budapest, where they promptly started plundering the city and its crown jewel, the National Museum, for all the artifacts taken by the Hungarians from Transylvania. The situation was so bad, in fact, that a lone American general had to LARP as a higher authority and physically prevent the Romanians from taking everything. I mean, sometimes jokes just write themselves, you know? The political situation inside the country turned into a complete and utter dumpster fire, so much so that the West intervened and alongside with the old aristocracy elected a new ruler, Horthy Miklós, an admiral without a navy who would serve as regent for a kingdom without a king, which at this point was much better than whatever the hell was going on. Soon after, the communists were kicked out of the country and forced to flee into Russia, now the USSR, and Hungary was forced to relinquish almost 70% of its territory as punishment for starting a dumb war and mistreating its minorities. And with a stroke of a pen, Austrian Hungary was no more, and what was left of Hungary was a sad, impoverished, and underdeveloped rump state.
János legyen, fenn a János hegyen, délután oda várom.
The interwar period for Hungary could be argued as the worst state the nation ever found itself in. As a consequence of Trianon and the stripping of nearly 2/3 of the nation's lands, Hungary's economy and living standard of its people greatly suffered. Historically, Hungary occupied a wide range of resource-diverse lands. As such, the nation organized and developed cities accordingly. Major manufacturing and mining hubs now lied in foreign-controlled lands, and Hungary was left with poorly developed agricultural lands that didn't have much economic value other than the output of wheat and cattle. As a result, its economy greatly suffered and its people became ever more revisionist and spiteful over the treaty that condemned them to this low-life existence. Meanwhile, in Germany, a country that suffered a similar fate to Hungary, except its boogeyman wasn't called Trianon but Versailles, also started to garner similar feelings. And from there, the Hungarian elites adopted these ideas quickly as well, as the ideas for an easy scapegoat that bypassed any sort of blame on the Hungarians themselves was far too tempting to ignore. Their ethnic minorities were the ones that stabbed them in the back and turned Hungary from a prestigious and proud nation with millennia of history into nothing more than an international joke. But there was a problem. With most of its territories taken away, there were no longer any minorities within Hungary that they could blame. None except one, the Jews. At this point, the Jews made up roughly 5% of the country's population, and although they did their best to integrate and embrace the local culture and language, at the end of the day, their peoples were the ones who were named as crucifying Christ. And when the tax collector came to take the peasantry's hard-earned cash, the man that took it away was more often than not Jewish. It also didn't help that as the Jews were relatively new arrivals in Hungary, they were limited to working in white-collar jobs, more particularly as landlords, bankers, and bureaucrats. As a result, antagonistic feelings against them grew amongst the Hungarian population, as the people who were tasked to screw them over, bureaucratically and financially, happened to be Jews. It didn't matter that despite all the other ethnic minorities that inhabited Greater Hungary, the Jews were one of the few that embraced Magyarization programs with open arms. It didn't matter that the Jews gladly became Hungarian and took up their customs and tried to serve the nation to their best of abilities, taking middleman jobs in taxation and administration as a way to integrate. Neither did it matter that they cherished the country and nation as their own. All that mattered was that they were different, and as a result, not Hungarian. As such, anti-Semitism started to become widespread and a prominent idea in the minds of the Hungarian ruling class. Now, before we go any further, we have to address a big controversial elephant in the room: Horthy. Throughout most of the interwar period, Horthy wasn't no liberal. Far from it. In the early days of his office, he was preoccupied with how to get the Habsburgs back on the throne and was a very staunch opponent to Trianon. Ideologically, he was very much a right-winger, monarchist, and most importantly of all, a rabid anti-communist. However, it is difficult to say whether or not he was an open anti-Semite. Throughout much of the 20s and even 30s, it was well known that he had strong Jewish ties when it came to friendship and businesses. Under his early days in office, many Jews held office in his cabinet as well. However, as fascist and anti-Semitic ideas became more widespread, the Hungarian government became slowly overwhelmed by staunch far-right representatives. Although, on many occasions, he tried to fight the discussion of the Jewish question in Hungarian politics, openly defending the existence of Jewish businesses in Hungary and argued their necessity in the nation's economy. In the 1930s, he even tried to cut a deal by agreeing to appoint a popular, increasingly right-wing prime minister if he just shut up about the Jews, which I guess in retrospect seems like a complete and utter oxymoron, but this was interwar period Hungary. Nothing made sense. Ultimately, the will of the people prevailed, and increasingly over the 30s, anti-Jewish laws were passed, and the Jews became ever more isolated from Hungarian internal affairs. Although Horthy had tried to argue against these changes, ultimately the parliament and prime minister were predominantly taken over by fascist ideologues. As a result, quickly the Jews were kicked out of public administration and barred from professions such as lawyers, publishers, physicians, and many others. It also didn't help that Germany was a strong proponent of these ideas and actively put an effort into aligning Hungary with its ideological worldview. An example of this occurred in the late 30s and early 40s with the First and Second Vienna Wars. In an effort to align Hungary with its worldview, Germany gave Hungary parts of its historical lands, such as southern Slovakia and northern Transylvania, essentially committing the grave sin of border gore and winning the sympathies of the Hungarian people's hearts and minds. By the late 1930s, a great majority of Hungarians were won over by Hitler's worldview and birthed Hungary's fascist party, the Arrow Cross Party, as well as radicalized the dominant Unity Party even more towards the right and anti-Semitism. Even so, Horthy was still skeptical of Germany. Increasingly more discriminatory laws were passed against the Jews, and although Horthy couldn't do much due to pressure from the Germans and his own people, he did restrict them from escalating to greater extremes. Ultimately, the German efforts to align Hungary were successful, and by the end of 1940, Hungary joined the Tripartite Alliance. The acquisition of these territories made Horthy more beloved and popular than the invention of sliced bread, but it also strengthened and expanded fascism. To fight this, Horthy attempted to improve ties with the West, but his efforts fell short, as the West was severely skeptical of the ways Hungary got its territories back, and the wide populace only cared about reversing Trianon, as in their eyes, the West were the ones who royally screwed them over. But this guy, Hitler, he was onto something, they thought. Their main goal was to revert Hungary to its pre-1914 state, and if he could provide that for them, then they were his top guy. However, Horthy still tried to fight Germany's influence as much as his power let him. In 1939, when World War II officially began and Germany invaded Poland, Horthy refused to lend them Hungary's railroad network for the invasion effort, and contrary to Hitler's desires, Hungary allowed the Polish military and civilian refugees to seek refuge within its territories and even escape through Yugoslavia into Greece. A year later, Hungary signed the Eternal Friendship Treaty with Yugoslavia in an effort to balance out the situation. A couple of weeks later, Hitler announced his invasion of Yugoslavia and pressured Hungary to join him. In response, the Hungarian Prime Minister committed suicide, claiming Hungary and Horthy lost their honor by breaking their promises. Pressures continued further. The same year in 1941, the German madmen decided to invade the Soviet Union. And again, Hungary was called upon to provide men and resources in crushing the Red Threat, to which they complied and sent their most advanced mechanized units to the Eastern Front. In 1942, Hungary was converted into an essentially pseudo-puppet state that was supplying most of its resources to the German war effort. But even so, some resistance to Germany's demands persisted. 2 years previously, Germany opened up the infamous extermination camp Auschwitz-Birkenau in its conquered territory of Poland, which was intended to deal with the Jewish question. To answer it, Germany demanded from Hungary to deport its Jews to the camp. However, Horthy continually resisted his demands by barring the deportation of Hungary's Jews outside of the country. Now, while Horthy's legacy regarding Hungary's anti-Semitic contributions is complex, it should not be misconstrued that he and the country were just victims of circumstance. That's absolutely not the case. Horthy actively sought to restore Hungary's pre-1914 borders and actively supported invading neighboring countries as a means to accomplish this. In many letters to Nazi officials and even politicians inside Hungary, Horthy used extreme anti-Semitic language to address the Jews and describe them as subhuman. And not to mention, as a head of state, it's impossible to claim that he had no agency whatsoever regarding how Hungary acted regarding its minorities and neighbors. In the end, those anti-Semitic laws were passed under him and were upheld. One of the most bloody and brutal parts of his legacy was the infamous southern Bachka raids. In 1942, reports came in that Serbian partisans had organized a base of operations in the reconquered province of Bachka. The Hungarian army was deployed, who then proceeded to raid cities and villages in the region in an effort to find these partisans. However, instead of targeting partisans, they instead turned their eyes towards the civilians and ended up brutally murdering over 4,000 Serbs and Jews, 500 of which were estimated to be children. By 1943, things started to go sour for the Axis in Hungary. At the Battle of Stalingrad, today known as Volgograd, the Hungarian army was completely and utterly decimated. 130,000 out of 200,000 Hungarian soldiers sent to fight were either killed or injured in action. This prompted Hungary to enter secret negotiations with the Allies as they could see the end on the horizon. But as much as Horthy tried to be sneaky and switch teams, Hitler quickly caught on. By 1944, Hungary started negotiating with the Soviets to exit the war. Almost immediately, Hitler deposed Horthy of his position and put the Aerocross party leader Ferenc Szálasi as the director of the country. Immediately, a rule of terror completely overtook Hungary, and the Jewish deportation programs that were stalled and up to this point even prevented finally came to fruition. For weeks, Auschwitz continually saw new arrivals of Hungarian Jews, many of whom were scheduled for immediate termination as the Germans saw their quota to be behind schedule. Meanwhile, the German army proper swarmed Hungary and started to heavily fortify the nation in preparation for the fight against the Soviets. The fall of that year was extremely brutal for the nation as battles raged across the entire country, while Budapest was bombed day and night by Allied forces. In December the same year, the siege of Budapest began and the city was plunged into mayhem for 3 months as heavy shelling and house-to-house urban warfare devastated the city. By February 1945, the city finally surrendered to the Soviets, and by April, all of Hungary. Immediately after the war, Hungary was occupied by the Soviets and a transition period to democracy ensued. Horthy was captured by American troops from German custody and subsequently used as a witness during the Nuremberg trials. During the trials, he helped expose the atrocities committed by the German regime, and as well as the ones that occurred under his own. Yugoslavia was adamant on prosecuting him, in particular for the atrocities committed in Bachka. However, the American and Soviet delegations objected to this and granted him amnesty due to his contribution in opposing anti-Semitic laws, and the deportation of Jews outside of Hungary. Following this, he was escorted to Portugal, where he lived out the rest of his life on a small beach town. Alongside with the Nuremberg trials, Hungary and Yugoslavia also held their own, where they tried and prosecuted Hungarian war criminals. What's significant about this is that Hungary immediately after the war was one of the few countries that prosecuted and convicted their own nationals for crimes against humanity and Nazi collaboration in the war. But even so, the nation was not allowed to hold the territories gained from the Vienna Awards, nor territories gained from its aggressive expansion. As a result, its borders were relegated to its post-Trianon form. Following this, Hungary held democratic elections. Yet, against what the Soviets expected, the Communist Party they had propped up performed miserably, and the Independent Smallholders Party, Független Kisgazdapárt, came out on top. For the next 2 years, the USSR supplied funding and helped the Communist Party gain significant leverage within the nation and penetrate other leftist parties. Ultimately, in 1947, they then proceeded to stage a coup and arrested centrist and center right-wing politicians. One by one, the communists subdued the other leftist parties and staged regular elections, where the Hungarian Workers' Party came out on top. Following this, oppositionaries were deported to the famously warm and sunny tundras of Siberia. And so, by 1949, the country was almost entirely purged of naysayers, and Hungarian People's Republic was proclaimed. With the proclamation of a socialist republic, the nation was, yet again, thrown into another authoritarian dark age, not long after it had just left it. Almost overnight, a secret police was established, the AVO, similar to the one in the Soviet Union, as well as a system of gulags. Terror took over the country as hundreds of thousands were put into kangaroo trials and subsequently imprisoned in these gulags or just simply executed. Also, like any other communist country, programs of forced collectivization were implemented and chaos was unleashed on the Hungarian peasantry and countryside. These programs of collectivist redistribution were so severely fumbled that to demonstrate how bad things were, I'd like you to take a look at Hungary on the map. As you can see, this country is lying on almost completely flat land surrounded by mountains. Now, if you can recall, in the beginning of this video, I mentioned that before Hungary was even conceived, this land used to be a sea brimming with life, and for millions of years, animals that lived here lived and died and were absorbed by the soil, which in return made today's Hungarian land some of the most fertile and nutrient-rich on the planet. Or if you're a creationist, God just favored them so much, he blessed them with it. Either way, if you take a look at what the landscape of Hungary looks like from the first person, whoops, not that one, but this one, it's all just endless fields of wheat as far as the eye can see. With all that in mind, the communist government fumbled handling this land so hard that there were severe food shortages and extensive food rationing. Now, let me reiterate so that everyone can understand. They possessed the best agricultural land in Europe, only second to Ukraine, and made the people starve at peacetime! Instead, Rákosi, the communist dictator, had the genius idea to focus on Hungarian industry and build up the country's steel production, even though there is virtually no iron in the country, and completely neglected the textile and agricultural industries, which for centuries were Hungary's bread and butter. So to say that the communist regime was retarded would be an understatement and an actual insult to mentally disabled people who have to wear a helmet at school as to not hurt themselves. As such, in the beginning of the 50s, Rákosi was pulled out of the country by the Soviets because they even found him to be mentally stunted and replaced him with Imre Nagy. Immediately upon taking office, he was tasked with cleaning up the mess Rákosi had created and fixing up the nation's agricultural policy. To his credit, Nagy was moderately successful, and reversing the train crash granted him vast popularity amongst the people. But Rákosi, being the megalomaniac he was, couldn't let that slide and was able to sweet-talk Moscow to oust Nagy and came back to power in 1955. Almost immediately upon his return, he went back to his dumbass policies and terrorized his people with more Stalinist secret police bullshit. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with the Hungarian peoples, and mass unrest followed with the demands for Nagy to return. Rákosi tried to suppress the protests, but his efforts backfired, and the people successfully defeated the AVO, and full-on revolution broke out. The Soviets, in a panic, sent a couple of armored divisions to the aid of their mentally challenged friend, but the Hungarians, successfully through guerrilla urban warfare, came out on top and forced them to go back to where they came from and reinstated Nagy. However, that wasn't enough for them, as when Nagy tried to subdue the protesters and address them, he got told to fuck off as well. This prompted him to try and reform the government by bringing non-communists into it, disbanding the secret police, and implementing a multi-party democracy. The Soviets couldn't let this slide and yet again invaded the country, this time with more vigor. In an attempt to get support from the West, Nagy proclaimed Hungary a neutral nation and called for Western intervention. But as the West was preoccupied with their own post-colonial and Middle Eastern BS and didn't want to escalate a Cold War into a hot one, his pleas fell on deaf ears. Although the Hungarians put up a fierce fight, throwing Molotovs down balconies and fighting in the streets with far superior enemies, ultimately they were unsuccessful and the revolution was crushed with an iron fist. Nagy attempted to flee to the Yugoslav embassy for refuge, but unfortunately, after the Soviets promised him safe passage, he was arrested and 2 years later executed. Following the revolution, János Kádár was placed as a new ruler and the AVH, aka the secret police, was reinstated, which then proceeded to wreak havoc and terror across the country, arresting the guilty and innocent alike. The army was also purged, as the vast majority of it sided with its people, whilst Soviet presence was intensified with military bases sprouting all over the nation. Although immediate retribution was swift and brutal, Hungary did not revert fully to its previous ways. Kádár soon after relaxed much of the Stalinist policies that gripped Hungary. Don't get it wrong, the country was still a police state dictatorship with severe restrictions when it came to freedom of speech and political opinion. However, the intensity of persecution against regular Hungarians was lowered. Alongside this, Kádár increased the production of consumer goods and opened up the country to foreign funds. At first, in the immediate late 50s and early 60s, it was just aid from the Soviet Union, but later on, Western aid and credit as well. In a term coined by economists, Goulash Communism, Hungary improved its living standard by taking on loans from foreign nations. Because of this mild liberalization, the Hungarians had a much better living standard than their comrades in the rest of the Eastern Bloc, and as long as they didn't criticize the government or communism too much, they enjoyed the freedom of opinion. However, as you can imagine, this economic revival didn't last, as Hungary's prosperity was tied to money that had a deadline to be paid off. And considering a great chunk of its industry and production wasn't profitable, eventually the chickens had to come home to roost. In the 70s, they did just that. Foreign aid and credit stopped coming into the country, and the nation plummeted yet again into economic decline. This fall continued well throughout the 80s, and political unrest ensued. Unlike in the rest of the Soviet bloc, where communism was abandoned in a fiery bang with grand demonstrations, the secret police and military firing Kalashnikovs, and the communist ruling couple being executed on live TV, in the words of my favorite author, Tomek Jankowski, in Hungary, the communist state was simply dismantled like a tent at the end of a camping trip. As this chapter of Hungarian history is extremely bureaucratic and political, I'll overlook a lot of the details so as to not bore you over what individual politicians said and did. Essentially, throughout the 1980s, liberalization was at its highest point. A bunch of Hungarians went abroad to study and, upon coming back home, realized that the economic system is extremely inadequate and inefficient. This, as a result, brought forth larger political and intellectual awareness in the country. The politicians slowly started to realize this and relegated Kádár to a more harmless position and started reforming the nation's political institutions. This led to the opening of free elections and a boom of new non-communist political parties. More people became more politically educated and aware of the situation in the country, and through reform, the Communist Party fell apart and elections were held in 1990, which established the Republic of Hungary and a non-communist government. Immediately after this, Hungary, like every other post-socialist republic, ran into huge obstacles it needed to overcome. The country was drowning in debt it acquired from its communist days. The infrastructure essentially wasn't updated since the 1930s, with roads that could barely be called that. And it had a painstakingly inefficient bureaucracy that prioritized employment over getting things done. The communists hadn't done the people any favor, and there was a huge clusterfuck of issues to be dealt with. But luckily, due to it being more liberal than other communist nations, Hungary had a very educated population. To solve the nation's problems, they just turned to bureaucratic and political reform. So that's what they mainly tackled. To fix the economy, the country would have to go through fundamental restructuring, which meant mass layoffs, factories shutting down, and worst of all, monstrous inflation. And no politician wanted to be responsible for any of that. So over the next couple of years, financial plans and reforms slowly took place that slowly but efficiently privatized the sector. This brought relative stability to the country. Then, throughout most of the 90s, Yugoslavia was going through its Spurg phase and dissolving into a million new countries. Hungary, during the Yugoslav War, supplied the Croats with weaponry and served as a military base for the Americans during the Bosnian War, which garnered the nation heavy favor to join NATO at the end of the conflict in 1999. To say the country was a bastion of stability and economic prosperity during this time period would be a lie. The nation was still plagued with many serious issues. I mean, hell, you don't have to look further than the clips on YouTube of Budapest underpasses to get a picture of the state the country found itself in. However, at the same time, it was experiencing the most stable time since 1947, not to mention it was decades ahead of its neighbors who were having a much worse transition period. Then, in 2004, the country joined the EU. In 2006, a major scandal hit the country and shook up its stability after its then Prime Minister, Ferenc Gyurcsany, admitted he was lying about his contributions and openly admitted to engaging in corruption in a private party speech which was leaked to the public. This came to be known as the Őszöd speech and subsequently resulted in mass protests and demonstrations against the government. Things then further worsened as the 2008 economic crisis got to Hungary and the economy took a nosedive, requiring the IMF and the EU to bail it out. As a result, in 2010, a relative newcomer, the FIDESZ party, took power under the leadership of him, you'll love to hate him, Viktor Orban, who took the opportunity and played off the disdain the public had for Gyurcsany and his center-left government, who admitted to abusing their power in office. Of course, he wasn't that much better, and almost immediately upon taking office formed a super coalition with other right-wing parties and amended the constitution in his favor by restricting the press, weakening the judicial system, and eliminating many government checks and balances, just to name a few. Throughout the 2010s, Orban was able to improve the economic situation in the country. However, he also deteriorated many of Hungary's democratic and liberal institutions, which today, in the 2020s, has named the nation the second most corrupt country in the EU, just after Bulgaria, and a crony and illiberal democracy. Under him, Hungary has also made some highly questionable deals with Russia, which is a whole can of worms for another time. And that brings us to today. What's in store for Hungary's future? We don't know, and if we're to consolidate with the board, nothing, because nothing ever happens. But hopefully it will be a pleasant nothing, with lots of money for everyone, and not just in the forms of inflated forints. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like and hit that subscribe button, and if you really did, become a member like these wonderful people. Or check out the ironicshop.com for my merch. My name is János, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey, why are you leaving?